I'm going to attempt the oil consumption fix as written out in this post, but since, according to the post, not everything is 100% documented, I have a copy of the service manual here that I'm going to be using to help me do this job. So I'll just jump right in, and I'm going to try to not say a whole lot of unnecessary words. Lift up this plastic piece from the driver's side, unscrew this black cap from the left cowl, pull the cowl off, pull out the fuel relay. It's way back in here. It's the middle one. We want to relieve the fuel pressure, so we're going to run the engine until it dies. Disconnect the battery terminal, jack up the car, place jack stands, place the container to catch the fluid, open the top, open the silcock. And here's where I found out that antifreeze is not necessarily antifreeze, and I'm supposed to be using Toyota Genuine long life coolant.
If you need to do a complete engine coolant flush like I am doing right now, you'll want to know that there is a valve for the coolant on the cylinder block as well as on the radiator. It's right here. It's kind of difficult to find. You turn that bolt and fluid comes out of that little tube right there. And I will zoom out and hopefully you will be able to find your way to that.
I have a 19mm socket on this breaker bar that I'm going to use on this bolt-like protrusion here. I will rotate this clockwise to loosen the tensioner. With the other hand, pull off the belt. Then release gently. To remove the generator, we're going to pry this little tab here that way and lift up. This boot comes off. 10mm socket. Put the nut back on for safekeeping. Remove a 12mm bolt, a 14mm bolt. Tilt the alternator toward the front of the car so that you can get a pick into the side of this little wire holder. Push the tab away from the plastic zip part and pull the zip out using your other hand so that you can remove this bundle of wires. Push here and then pull. In theory, you wiggle this out, although for me, it took me an hour to get this thing out. And what I ended up having to do was to basically force it this way and then force it back and force it this way and force it back while I was pulling up on it. And turns out I don't think I'm the one responsible for this damage. Well, maybe I am with all that forcing that I did. I don't know. Anyway, it looks like what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to sand that down and sand down the corresponding spots on the car so that when I put it in, it won't be quite so difficult to get out. Maybe I'll put a little bit of oil there or something. Put the two bolts you removed back into the alternator. We want to disconnect the exhaust pipe from the exhaust manifold, and in order to do that we have to take this bolt out and the one up there, but we can't get to that bolt there so long as this oxygen sensor is in place. Easy might not be the word for it, but you can get to it from the top using a long extension and a number 12 socket. One on the left is pretty much the same deal. Once you've got the nuts out, you can crawl under the car and gently remove the oxygen sensor. Remove the oxygen sensor gasket and set the gasket and nuts aside. Put your breaker bar in like so. Finish with an ordinary ratchet. And the other side as well. Remove the gasket from between the exhaust and the manifold. Use a 14mm combination wrench to remove the upper bolt on the exhaust manifold stay. Use a 12mm socket to remove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts. Remove the heat shield. Replace the bolts so they don't get lost. Use a 12mm socket on a breaker bar to get off 4 of the 5 nuts you need to remove in order to get off the exhaust manifold. 1, 2, 3, 4. For the 5th bolt, you'll have to use a 12mm combination wrench. Once the bolts are cracked with the breaker bar, you can switch to using an ordinary ratchet. Once all 5 bolts are gone, the exhaust manifold should simply slide off and lift out. Stuff a clean rag. Store the exhaust manifold bolts on the exhaust manifold. Put the manifold stay bolt back on the manifold stay for safekeeping. Remove the old exhaust manifold gasket. Put the nuts back on the studs for safekeeping. Slide Slide in an oil drain container and go ahead and drain the oil. If you still have them, take out the 2 clips from here and here. Then a 10mm socket will take out this nut and this nut. Remove the plastic cover, put the 2 nuts back, pull the wires off of the coil packs. Use a 10mm ratchet to remove these 4 bolts from the coil packs. Remove the coil packs. Be certain that the boots come off with the coil packs. Set the bolts back into their screw hole so that they don't get lost. Use a hand vac to suck up anything that might fall into the engine. Use a 16mm or 5/8 inch spark plug socket with an O-ring on the inside to hold on to the spark plug to remove each of the spark plugs from the engine. Remember to hold on to the head of the wrench as you turn it so that it doesn't wobble back and forth and break the spark plug as you're turning. A number 2 screwdriver to undo the screw that holds this clamp shut and this clamp shut. Work the hose off. Stuff a rag or some clean paper towels into the filter box outlet. Remove the accelerator cable by tilting this up and then pulling the cable out in this direction. Push the 2 clips up on either side in order to be able to remove this connector and pull the wires off. Undo that bolt. It's 12mm. Set the accelerator cable aside and put the bolt back in the hole. Unclamp the PCV hose and remove the hose. Unclamp the second PCV hose and pull it off. Disconnect the throttle position sensor by pushing this way on the tab on the top and pulling away. Disconnect the IAC valve connector by pushing on the tab and pulling it away from the throttle body. Use a pair of pliers to slide back the clamps on the 2 bypass hoses. If the hose is stuck, just use a thin flathead screwdriver and stick it between the hose and the fitting and just turn it a little bit. Not too much. You're not trying to pry it off, you're just trying to break anything that might be sticking the 2 together. And then you should be able to slide the hose right off. And a pair of needle nose stuck in from the back seem to work the best, at least for the rear hose. Use a 12mm socket and a 1-inch extension to remove 2 nuts from both sides of the throttle body. Remove the throttle body and the gasket. Put the nuts back onto the studs and the bolt back into the hole. Remove the 4 injector connectors by pushing hard on the tab on the side and lifting up at the same time. Place a tin can below the fuel line to catch any fuel that might spill as you disconnect the line. Unsnap the connector. If you don't happen to have a fuel line quick disconnect tool like I didn't, you can make one fairly easily. Just take a large barreled Sharpie, remove the cap, and cut the cap where it starts to get smaller. Then put a slit down the length. Cut the fingertips off of 2 nitrile gloves. Wash off the quick disconnect fitting. Better water than dirt in the line, that's for sure. Place your quick disconnect tool onto the fuel line. Push this hose that way. At the same time, you push the tool into the hose. There's no real good way for me to do this and film it. When you do that, this is going to be released, and you can pull it off. Make sure that you get the gasoline in this can. Use the fingertip ends you cut off earlier to cover the hose and the tube. Use some tape to tie up the end. Be absolutely certain you're using nitrile gloves and not latex, because latex will just melt. Also, I used 5 layers of fingertips because these were pretty thin gloves. Use a 10mm socket on a 3-inch extension to remove the bolt that holds down the fuel tube. Use a 12mm socket to remove the 2 bolts which hold down the fuel rail. Pull out the fuel rail this way. Use a hand vac to suck up any debris so it doesn't fall into the engine. Put back the fuel tube bolt along with the fuel rail bolt so they don't get lost. Remove the camshaft position sensor connector. Remove the ECT sensor wire. You can reach your hand in from this angle to get to it. Use a 10mm combination wrench to remove the 2 bolts that hold on the grounding wires. Put the grounding wire bolts back in so they don't get lost. Squeeze the clamps holding on the PCV hose from the intake manifold. Slide it back and remove the hose from the intake manifold. I found it was easier for me to remove the hose by pulling on the other end of it back here. Remember, we already disconnected this end from the top. Use a pair of pliers to move back the clamp on the brake vacuum booster hose. Then remove the brake booster hose from the intake manifold. This is the lower hose. Use a pair of pliers to slide back the evap hose clamp and remove the evap hose from the intake manifold. I find it easiest to pull on the hose from this side once the clamp is removed. Remove the coolant hose from the hose clamp, set it aside, and use a 12mm socket on a 1-inch extension to remove the 2 bolts that hold the hose clamp to the intake manifold in the engine. Remove the hose clamp and put the bolt that came out of the bottom part of the hose clamp back in, but don't put the other one back in. Use a 12mm socket to remove the upper bolt on the intake manifold stay. Add a 1-inch extension to the 12mm socket and remove the lower bolt as well. The manifold stay is actually attached to a cable, so you don't need to take it out, you can just leave it in there. All we have to do is return the bolts to the hole so we don't lose them. Use a 12mm socket on a 1-inch extension to remove the 2 nuts holding on the engine wire harness. Remove the engine wire and harness and place the nuts back on the studs. Using a 12mm socket and a 1-inch extension, remove the 2 intake manifold bolts. Remove the intake manifold. Turn it sideways to take it out. Remove the intake manifold gasket. Place the nuts and bolts for safekeeping. Use a 10mm socket to remove the camshaft sensor bolt. Remove the camshaft position sensor. Replace the sensor bolt. Use a 19mm deep socket to remove the engine coolant temperature sensor. Once you have it cracked loose, you can remove it by hand. Remove the oil fill cap. The next instruction is to remove the camshaft timing sprockets. When we go over there, we will find that there are a lot of things we've already done, like drain the engine coolant and whatnot, and there are some things we don't plan on doing, like disconnecting the power steering pump. So what we're going to do is we're going to scroll down here to removing the cylinder head cover. We've already done steps A and B, and we're going to start with C, remove the 2 bolts and the engine wire. If you're wondering why it was I already removed the exhaust manifold, unlike what was done in the forum post, the reason is that my engine wire harness is a little bit different. Mine runs all the way across and has this wire that comes down to this power steering pump. I don't know what that's for exactly. All I know is that it wasn't easy to remove. And because of that, I'm unable to pick this whole thing up and drape it over on the driver's side like what was done in the forum post. So there was no way for me to lift the whole thing out as a single unit. Now we're going to take a 10mm socket and remove the 2 nuts, they said bolts, but they're nuts, from the wire harness. Remove the engine wire harness along with this extra little piece here and set it over the back of the engine. Then reattach the nuts onto the studs so we don't lose them. Remove this nut that we put on earlier for safekeeping, and then use a 12mm deep socket to remove this stud/bolt combination. Place the nut right away so we don't lose it. Use a 10mm socket to remove 8 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and also 2 nuts. 1, 2. Remove the corner bracket. Remove the valve cover. Remove the old gasket. Unlike before, I'm not going to return all this hardware to the engine because it's dirty and I really don't want a whole lot of dirt falling in there. Set them aside for later. I'm going to remove any visible debris that I see just so that it doesn't fall down any further into the engine. We're just going to remove 1 sprocket. We're going to leave this one on. To remove it, we're going to use a crescent wrench to hold this hexagon-shaped part of the camshaft here. And we're going to use a 14mm wrench to turn the bolt there. Put the wrench on this hexagonal part and pull this way, being careful not to damage either the cam or the lifters. And at the same time, push with your wrench on the bolt. Once the bolt is broken loose, it should come out easily.
Remove the sprocket by sliding it this direction, then unhook the chain and lift the sprocket out. Return the bolt so it doesn't get lost. Next thing we need to do is to remove the 19 bearing cap bolts in the order specified by this diagram. We want to do it just a little bit at a time so that nothing warps. Using a 10mm socket, crack the bolts in order, one at a time. These 3 bolts require a 12mm socket. On the second pass, loosen them just a hair more. Once you've gone past the point where the bolts are making cracking sounds, you can go ahead and go a little bit faster. Give each pair 2 half turns. Every time you loosen one of these pairs, another pair somewhere else is going to get tighter. Once you've reached the point where there's absolutely no cap that is under tension, you can go ahead and speed up and remove the bolts much more rapidly. 4 or 5 turns per bolt, but still go ahead and do it in sequence just to be absolutely certain that you haven't missed anything. Once the bolts are completely loose, you can remove the bearing caps. Do that by screwing the bolts in just a couple of threads so that they are held in place. Then lift up on the bearing cap to de-seat it from the bearing surface. The oil will have it sucked in. Then you can go ahead and loosen the bolts all the way again and lift the entire thing off. The reason you want to do this is because you don't want the threads of these bolts to mar that surface. Each of these caps is marked with either an I or an E for intake or exhaust, along with a cylinder number and an arrow pointing toward the front of the engine. But despite that, I'm going to go ahead and put them in this container in order, just so that I can be absolutely certain I don't mess up later. This container is number 5 polypropylene, so I know it's compatible with motor oil. I hope this doesn't happen to you, but I struggled for about an hour just trying to get this particular bearing cap off. What I ended up having to do in the end was to take a ratchet and pry it out, but I didn't want to damage the surface between this part and this part. I didn't want to damage the seating surface. So what I did is I set this arm against the outside and put this under like that and push down. Not too hard, but just hard enough to make it move just a hair. And then I repeated that process on the other side, and I kept doing that until it finally came out. Lift out the camshaft and slide it out from beneath the chain. Move the chain off of the sprockets. Lift out the other camshaft and do exactly the same thing as you did with the first. Use your other hand to make sure this chain doesn't get caught on the sprockets. In the service manual, they take out the camshafts before removing the head, unlike what was done in the forum post. I went ahead and followed the service manual instructions just because I want the head to be as light as possible when I remove it. Here's where you need to be careful. The next step in the original post was to remove the cylinder head, but the OP's car didn't have VVTi, unlike mine. And if yours has VVTi, you need to remove the camshaft, timing, oil control valve, and filter first, before removing the head bolts and the head. Otherwise, this control valve will break. Push on the tab and pull back to remove the oil control valve connector. Use a 10mm socket on the 3-inch extension to remove the bolt from the valve. It takes a little bit of effort to pull the valve straight out. It sticks because of the O-ring and the oil. Replace the bolt. Use a 14mm socket on the 3-inch extension to remove the filter bolt. Have a paper towel under this bolt as you remove it, because when it comes all the way out, oil is going to come out of the hole. Also, be sure you get the gasket along with the bolt. You might have to go in after it with a pair of needle nose pliers. Just grab this in and pull very gently. Remove the last engine wire harness mounts bolt using a 10mm combination wrench. Pull the mount away and replace the bolt. Use a pair of pliers to slide back the upper radiator hose and remove the hose from the engine. Do the same thing for the smaller heater hose. When you get to the point where the heater hose is actually coming off, you probably want to stick a can down in here, because the heater hose is going to drop fluid as soon as you pull it off all the way. Use a 10mm socket on a 3-inch extension to remove the bolt on the bypass pipe that's attached to the head. You won't be able to replace this bolt right away, so just set it aside. Now it's time to remove the head bolts. For this, we need that 10mm bi-hexagon bit you hopefully already purchased and received. We're going to do this exactly the same way that we remove the bearing caps, that is, slowly, a little bit at a time, and following the diagram in the service manual. Please wear safety glasses and gloves while you're doing this part of the job. You really don't want anybody's face, eyes, or hands redesigned by that tool if it happens to break while you're doing this. It's going to take a lot of force to remove these torque-to-yield bolts. You'll need a breaker bar to do this. Start by just cracking
first pass through, I thought for sure I was going to shatter this tool. And on the second pass, it's not a whole lot easier. It took about 7 or 8 passes for all the bolts to become completely loose. Once they're like that, you can just unscrew them and pull them out. Remember that these bolts are torqued to yield, so they're basically trash now. Use a magnetic pickup tool of some sort to get the harder to reach washers. Be very, very careful when you are removing those washers. I dropped one down my head, and it was not fun to retrieve. I had no idea where it went. I finally found it way over here at the next area. So really, you want to use a magnet to get those things out. Use one hand to lift up the timing chain, while you use the other hand on a 10mm combination wrench to remove the bolt that's way down in there. Once you've got that bolt cracked, you want to prepare some sort of magnetic capture tool. And you should probably tie it to the car. If you lose that bolt way down into there, you're going to have to take the timing chain cover off, and that really doesn't sound like a good time. Even with my magnetic tool, I almost lost this bolt, so be extra careful. Also, this chain needs to be on the right side when you're trying to take that bolt out. If it's on the left side, the chain gets in the way of turning the bolt, and it's nearly impossible to remove. Set the bolt and washer aside. Using a 10mm socket, loosen the nut that's here. You don't need to take it all the way off. Use an external E5 Torx socket to remove the stud. You can leave the nut on while you do this. Use a 12mm combination wrench to loosen this nut. Again, you don't have to take it all the way off. Use an E7 external Torx socket to remove the stud. The OP said he didn't have an E7, so he used an E8. You can get an E7 socket from Gear Wrench if you want one. Use your 10mm combo wrench to remove this bolt, this bolt, this bolt. Set the hardware aside. Use a pair of pliers to remove the last remaining hose's clamp. The hose isn't connected to anything, so set it aside. Double and triple check to make sure you have every hose, every harness, every bolt disconnected. Now it's time to remove the head. If you find yourself having to really pry at the head, you better double check to make certain that you have everything disconnected. I went ahead and left this hook on so that I could hold on to this at the same time that I lift, and I was able to rock this back part off. Then I was able to push on this and pull up at the same time and get the front portion up. Now I have everything sort of broken loose. It should be pretty easy to take out. There are 1/4-inch tubes that stick out here under the heads, so when you remove the head you have to lift it straight up before you can really pull it forward. Now I'm going to take the opportunity to wipe away anything that might fall down in there. I'm also going to leave this gasket in place for now. It helps protect the mating surface, and I just don't see any reason to remove it just yet. Use a 10mm socket and about 6 inches worth of extension to remove 10 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 2 nuts. 1, 2. Use a 1/4-inch 10mm socket to get the next 2 closest bolts. I took this clip without the oil pan in place, but go ahead and pull off this black plastic cover. You'll need a 10mm combination wrench to get the last 2 bolts out. Set that hardware aside for later. They seem to have bent the lip on the oil pan slightly and marred up the surface somewhat over here. I would suggest that when you take your oil pan off, you try to take it easy. I don't know how well that really works. It's a difficult thing to do. If you can get a hold of the service tool, then great. If not, just try not to do what I did. For those of you who have absolutely no experience with working on cars, one thing that you'll want to know that I didn't know when I first started working on them is that the front of the car is not the same thing as the front of the engine. So every time I would look in the service manual and it would say, remove such and such connection from the front of the engine, I'd always look toward the front of the car. Luckily, a good friend of mine told me that the front of the engine is where the pulleys are. Remove each lifter one at a time. Write down the number that's on the inside of the lifter. This one says 38. And set the lifters aside in the same order that you remove them, so you know exactly which lifter goes to which valve. Next we'll be using the valve spring compressor, which despite its potentially intimidating appearance is actually very easy to use. The tool comes with 2 heads, and we want the smaller of the 2. This is just an area to keep the one we don't need. All you do is unscrew this, and put the correct one down here, and then put the one you don't need up here. The goal here is just to have this distance be a little bit larger than the distance between the spring cap and the valve when we install this tool. open this lever, set this cup against the valve on the bottom of the head, close this. This will come in close proximity to the spring cap, but not actually quite touch it. Then you simply turn this handle to move this bar up, which will compress the spring. I have this installed and we're just about ready to go. The two things to keep in mind are that you want that circular part to be square on the spring seat. You don't want it cattywampus. And the same is true for the bottom. You basically want that cup square onto the valve. You shouldn't take too much effort to compress the spring. If you find yourself having to really torque on the handle, then you need to remove the tool, recenter everything, and try again. If you really can't get the spring cap to go down, then you should probably get a small tube, set it on top of the spring cap, and tap it with a hammer. That's per the instructions that came with the tool. Once the spring is compressed, you can use your screwdriver and magnet to remove the two collets. Remove the spring. Push the valve stem in a little bit and retrieve the valve from the other side. Next step is to take out these valve stem seals, and they are a real bear to get out, unfortunately. You need to be careful not to damage the valve stem guide, which is this metal tube that sticks out of the inside. Unfortunately, it goes right through the middle of this, so you can't just take your pair of needle nose pliers and stick it down the hole like that and squeeze and pull, because you'll basically be putting teeth mark into that valve guide, which is a big no-no. And you also at the same time want to be very careful not to damage this outside wall. Now the OP said that he used a pair of needle nose pliers. I found this to be extraordinarily difficult because they form this V shape when they grab a hold of the seal, and they only contact at one point, and I tore two of the seals up trying to get them out using a pair of needle nose pliers. They do sell valve seal pliers that you can purchase from eBay for $13, and there's a little specialized tool with a small round head. I would suggest for $13 that you go ahead and spend the money if you have the time, because for $13 to have the right tool I think is a really nice thing, especially when you're in here and you don't want to mar up all of these surfaces. However, I didn't know this ahead of time and I didn't buy the tool, so I went down to Home Depot and instead I bought the 6.5-inch long locking pliers, and they're sort of like needle nose pliers except that they're a locking variant, and they just barely are long enough to get down in there. If you decide to go this route, I suggest you get something a little bit longer than 6.5 and hopefully a little bit narrower so that you don't have any problems getting down in here. But as I said, these are just barely long enough if you need to use something like this. Regardless, what you want to do is to grab the outside of the seal just on the edge, like that. Let's see if I can get a better picture of that. Just on the edge, like that, using your locking pliers or your needle nose pliers, or if you have the real tool, then just grab the whole thing. And I found the best thing to do is to pull gently while you are twisting back and forth. And you want to make a fairly big twisting motion, not a small one. Well, I guess it depends on your point of view. About that much twisting. And pull at the same time. And if you're lucky, then you'll get it to come out without too much difficulty. Oh, hey, there it came out. And you can see that these locking pliers are much more parallel when they're closed around the seal, which makes them a much better tool for this job. If you choose not to buy that $13 tool, you'll probably have to remove this hook in order to get to those two seals. Deep in the bottom you'll find one more washer. Use a magnet to get it out. Next step is to clean the head. Use carburetor cleaner and also a brass brush to clean out these areas. Then clean up the gasket seating area for the intake and exhaust manifold. Be careful not to mar the seating area on the head. You can use 100% cotton swabs with paper handles to clean out the inside of the valve guides. Once your valve guides are clean, use your air compressor to blow air through the valve guides to make sure that no cotton fibers are left behind. Take one last pass with some carb cleaner and some towels just to clean up the mating surfaces of the head. Don't spray the carb cleaner directly on the head, spray it on the towel first and then remove any varnish that you see. Use a single-edged razor blade to gently remove any gasket material that's left on the side of the cylinder head. Use a pressure washer and a bucket of hot water with Dawn in it to clean the cylinder head. I don't have a real pressure washer, so I'm using this 90 psi washing wand with my air compressor. Rinse out all the Dawn in the bathtub. Use an air compressor air gun to blow out any water that remains in the cylinder head. Remove the carbon deposits using a wire wheel on a bench grinder. It takes just a few minutes per valve. Take out the valve stem seals from your gasket kit and put them into a jar or can with some standard motor oil, whatever you would put in the car. Take some of the motor oil, dip your finger in it, and just coat the valve stem. Then insert the valve stem and place the head on a surface in such a way that the valve stem will not fall out. Place the straw with the rounded side up over the end of the valve stem. This will protect the valve stem seal from the keeper slot on the valve stem. Take one of the lubricated valve stem seals and simply place it on top of that straw and push it down. Remove this plastic straw-like object. Take a 10 millimeter deep socket. You don't want to use a standard shallow one because the stem will not pass all the way through. Right over the valve stem and onto the valve stem seal. Then you can tap on this with a rubber mallet or hammer, and it will sort of change sound when you get it in the right spot. Visually inspect the valve stem seal to make sure it's properly seated. Drop in the spring seat and make sure that it's sitting in its proper little groove. Place on the spring and the upper spring seat. Reattach the spring compression tool. Keepers are cone-shaped. The large end goes up, the small end goes down. Use a pair of tweezers to drop it into the slot. Compress the spring until there's enough room for both keepers to be installed. You want to get it down low enough that the keepers are actually slightly below the notch that they'll eventually end up in. When you release the pressure slowly, they'll just snap right into place. When properly installed, the keepers should sit in nicely. Lubricate the inside and outside of the bucket lifter. And then set it in. After you've cleaned out the oil pan, use a single edge razor blade to remove any gasket material from the mating surface. There's no good, relatively non-toxic solvent for RTV, so the only way to remove it really is mechanically. After you have used the razor blade, you can use an ordinary scrubby, one of the non-scratch variety, to remove any remaining RTV. Use an air gun to blow out any RTV and other material that might be inside the oil pan. If you bent your oil pan when you were removing it, remember to fix that before you reinstall. So to fix this, I basically just set this down onto a wooden surface and held this flat while I hit the lip of the oil pan where the bend was using this heavy engineer's hammer. If you hold the pan in such a way that you can get something straight to reflect along the surface of the pan, then as long as you can get that reflection relatively straight between the screw holes, I think you'll be okay. Use a 19 millimeter socket to rotate the crankshaft clockwise until two of the pistons are at the top of their cylinders. Hold the timing chain taut so that it doesn't bind on it. Use a 10 millimeter socket on a 3-inch extension to loosen this bolt, and then remove these two nuts and swing over the oil filter unit. Use a 10 millimeter 12-point socket on the end of a breaker bar to remove the two bolts from the end of the bearing cap. Pull the bearing cap off, being careful not to get it dirty. Take a long 1/4-inch socket extension and put the end of it into the screw hole of the piston rod. Put it in the hole that's closer to the rear of the vehicle. Then push straight up and out. Be careful not to damage anything. You'll need a partner on the outside in order to retrieve the piston. As soon as you have the piston out, put the bearing cap on right away. You'll notice that there are a couple of pins on either side, and they mate with some holes in the bearing cap. The first one that you take out, put it back together correctly so that the pins mate. Repeat on the other side, making certain to keep the pistons in the correct order so that you know what order to put them back. This one is going to be more difficult because it's under the support beam and the extension doesn't go in nearly as easily. The second one that you take out, pull the bolts all the way out, turn the bearing cap around, and put it back on the wrong way. And don't put the bolts all the way on. This is a good way to remind yourself which one you took off first and which one you took off second. You'll have to remember whether the one you took off first came from the passenger side or the driver's side. To take the rings off of the piston, all you have to do is push gently and lift the ring out of the slot. Then work it around like so and pull it out on the other side. Do the same thing for the second one. The other rings are really easy. These are the oil rings. Turn it until you find the two ends. Remove the two outside rails first. They come off very easily. And then remove the oil control ring. You just need to find the spot where the ring closes, which looks not like a bump, but just looks like two lines connected together. Turn it until you find the part where the ring butts against itself. And slide the two pieces apart. If they don't want to come apart, you can use a pair of needle nose pliers to help push them apart. There we go. Pull the ring open, and then just slide it off. Take the rings that you pulled off of the piston and bend the first one at a 90-degree angle. Cover it with a piece of paper towel and bend it. Do the exact same thing with the second ring, except this time it will break. It's quite brittle. Use the bent and broken piston ring pieces to clean the slots in the piston. Simply set the ring into the slot and run it around to remove the gunk. Use the first bent one for the upper ring and the second broken one for the middle ring. Once you have that cleaned, you can use the broken piece to also clean out the third oil control ring area. If the bearing surfaces show galling, you'll have to replace the main bearings. Just come right out. Slide a glove over the bearing cap and the connecting rod. Use a piece of tape to tie up the glove. Soak the top part of the piston all the way up to the oil control ring slot in Berryman Chem Dip, carburetor and parts cleaner. You can get this at Walmart for about $20. Don't let it go any further than that, though. You can use a piece of string to suspend it inside the liquid. The reason I say that is because I don't think it would be a good idea to get this Chem Dip stuff into the wrist pin. The instructions say that you shouldn't leave anything in the Chem Dip for longer than 4 hours because it may start to damage the polished surfaces. And that is definitely a polished surface on the wrist pin. So if it were to get stuck in there and you didn't have a way to get it out, then that seems like it would be a bad thing. Anyway, I left mine soaking in there for about 4 hours, and the stuff works amazingly well, actually. You can take it out and use a brass brush to clean up the bottom, and anything that won't come out, you can use a Dremel and a brass brush attachment to power out anything that remains. You can also dip the skirts into Berrymans if you just hold it like this wearing gloved hands and dip it down into the Berrymans for about 60 seconds. That's about all it takes. Once you're done, rinse this stuff off in water. Then take a air hose and get as much water off as you can. Then use carburetor cleaner to wipe off anything that remains and to drive out any remaining water. And finally use your air hose again to finish drying it out and drive out anything else. Remove the bearings if that is necessary because you're changing them. And you can wipe either the bearing or this area without the bearing, depending on whether you're changing the bearings or not, with a little bit of carburetor cleaner and a rag. Now we're ready to drill our 2 extra holes. Since we're of the ounce of prevention school of thought, I have taped a glove over the bearing area. There's no reason to get aluminum chips down in there if we don't have to. As it comes from the factory, there are 2 holes on either side, and what we're going to do is drill a third one right in the middle, then turn this around 180 degrees and drill another hole there right in the middle. There are probably a million different ways you could drill this hole. Ideally, you would use a drill press. If you don't have one, you, I suppose, could use a hand drill. I am using a Dremel and a vise. Once you have drilled your holes, you will have aluminum shavings everywhere, and now you have to blow them out and spray them out and do whatever you can to get rid of every last little shaving. Put the new rings on the piston. Start with the oil ring. It just sort of slides open like that. You can slide it open and put it onto the bottom slot. Then add the two rings to the top and bottom. These rings, at least on my set, don't have any markings on the top or the bottom, so it doesn't matter which way you put them on. Double check your set to make certain that that is the case. The compression rings do have markings on them. Make sure that you put the writing up. Now, you need to also make certain that you get the right ring on the right slot. The second ring is the one in the middle. The first ring, this one, is the one on the top. To put these on is a little bit tricky. You might want to have a ring compressor, but I didn't have one and I didn't really need it, I decided. You just kind of put it into the slot and then very gently work it around, sort of the same way that you took it off, only in reverse. And you have to be careful not to break the second ring because it is the fragile one. The middle one is the one that will just snap if you put too much pressure. And I'm not going to do it because I don't want to be recording and do this at the same time. I don't want to break the ring. And you can do the exact same thing for the first. I'll go ahead and put the first one on because it's not as fragile. So you just slide it into the slot, like so, and just sort of work it around like that. On it goes. It's pretty easy. Now we're going to hone the cylinder. Put some towels or paper towels down into the bottom of the cylinder, tuck them under the lip at the bottom on all sides, and try to eliminate as much of the gap as you can. You don't want anything to fall past those towels into either the oil chambers or onto the crankshaft. Also, you don't want the towels sticking up into the cylinder, because if they stick up into the cylinder, there's a good chance you'll catch them with a hone when you're doing the honing. Plug or cover any holes you don't want grit in. Cover the inside of the cylinder with some motor oil. Some people like to use transmission fluid, apparently. The OP used WD-40. As far as I can tell, it doesn't really matter a whole lot what you use. Mainly you just want it to stick to the walls and carry away the grit. Coat the honing stones as well. Check the speed on your drill. This one has two speeds, a high speed and a low speed. We're going to go with a low speed so that we're about 400 or 500 RPM, 400 in this case at full speed. The goal is to get a nice crosshatch pattern, and in order to do that we need to go up and down a sufficient number of times for the number of RPMs that we're going. At 400 RPM you're basically going to have to bring this thing up and down pretty much as fast as you can in order to get that 30-degree hatch pattern. Insert the hone into the cylinder and push it down to the point where it's just past the actual cylinder walls, the polished part of the cylinder walls. Then you'll have a good idea of how far down you can push down the hone before grabbing the rags inside. Try to remember how deep the hone goes on the sides so that you don't go past that point when you're actually honing. Run the drill for about 30 seconds. Then stop the drill, squeeze the stones, and pull out the hone. Some people say you should leave the drill running while you pull the hone out of the block, but I don't like to do that because as soon as the hone comes out, it sprays grit everywhere. And that gunk right there is exactly why we want to cover up the timing chain. You do not want that in your engine. Wipe out as much grit as you can with paper towels. Keep doing this until the paper towel comes out completely clean. That's pretty good. Make sure that when you do this, you get under that ridge below. Make absolutely certain there's nothing under there either. Now you can switch to some warm water and Dawn. And basically repeat the process. Use a dry paper towel and go over the inside of the cylinder to remove any remaining water. Be absolutely certain it comes out completely clean. You can remove the wadded up towels that we stuck in here earlier. Remove all the stuffing that we added. Remove the bearing cap from the piston you are installing. Be sure to leave the other one installed. Saturate the rings with oil, lubricate the sides, wrist pin, and end rod bearings, then coat the inside of the cylinder wall with oil. Place the piston into the correct position in the cylinder block with the flanged portion facing the front of the car, and so that the end rod bearing surface is parallel to the crankshaft journal below. Turn the rings so that the open area on each ring is pointed into a different corner of the piston. You don't want the cut spot on the rings to face squarely forward, back, or to either side. Place the cut piece of 3-inch PVC pipe over the piston. When you prepare this piece of PVC pipe, be sure at least one side is completely flat and perpendicular to the tube. Squeeze the tube to compress the rings and use the handle end of a hammer to tap the piston into the cylinder block. Tap the piston into place from above. You'll need somebody under the car to guide the end of the rod onto the journal. Lubricate the bearing and install the bearing cap, making certain that the holes in the bearing cap line up with the pins in the end of the rod. Use a 10mm 12-point socket on your torque wrench to install the 2 bolts for the bearing cap. You ultimately want to get that all the way up to 180 inch-pounds, but you don't want to get there right away. What you want to do is start out around 60 and then go to maybe 100 and then 140 and then ultimately 180. You want to do a little bit on one bolt and then a little bit on the other bolt until eventually the torque wrench gives on both of them, and then bump your torque setting. Once you have them both torqued to 180 inch-pounds, take a clean cloth and wipe the oil off the bottom of the bolt. Then use a Sharpie to draw a mark. Use the same socket on a breaker bar to turn the bolts an additional 90 degrees using the marks that you just drew on them. Clean the mating surface of the timing chain cover by very gently scraping it with a single-edged razor blade. Be very careful not to mar the mating surface. Hold the timing chain taut, and at the same time use a 21mm socket on a ratchet to rotate the crankshaft until the timing mark on the crankshaft lines up with the 0, and simultaneously these 2 yellow links are out of the engine. Once the timing chain and crankshaft are in the right position, suspend the timing chain using a bungee cord. Install the head gasket onto the cylinder block. Make certain that you have everything lined up correctly and that the gasket is installed right side up. The OP said he managed to install the cylinder head without having to do anything to the timing chain tensioner. But I found that this small nub on the timing chain guide got in the way of my installation. So I had to lock the tensioner in the rear position so that this nub would be out of the way. Remove the 2 nuts that hold in the timing chain tensioner. Pull out the tensioner. You might have to push from the other side. Hold the timing chain tensioner in your hand like this. Move this little latch out. Then hold back this little notched area while you squeeze in the piston and then lock the piston in place. Reinstall the timing chain tensioner with the latch toward the front of the engine and the piston toward the rear. Reinstall the 2 nuts. Carburetor cleaner leaves behind a lubricating residue that's not good for RTV seals, so re-clean the mating surface between the cylinder head and the timing chain cover using a cleaner that does not leave a residue behind, like mass airflow sensor cleaner or brake cleaner. Once you have all these mating surfaces cleaned using non-residue cleaner, try not to touch them again. Double check to make sure everything is ready. Also double check to make sure you have all of the tools and all of the parts necessary to properly install the head. We have the 10mm bi-hexagon bit. We have our head bolts. We have our washers. We have the shim we're going to use. Gasket material. Tip. The torque. 36 foot-pounds and the torquing order. We have our breaker bar, which we'll use to do the last 90-degree turn. Our torque wrench so we can torque things down correctly, and a light so we can see what we're doing. I recommend you do a dry run when you go to install a cylinder head. Do it without any RTV so that you can see whether or not everything fits before you go to do it for real. If you don't do this, chances are that you're not going to get it in the right way the first time, and you're just going to end up with a big mess to clean up. These 2 pins actually go into the screw holes on the head. So when you're putting on the head, you can have a person look down the screw hole and line up those screw holes with the pins. When you're installing the head, there'll be 2 points you want to be careful about. The first is this hole for the heater bypass pipe, and the second one is this nub on the timing chain guide. So that you don't mar the mating surface of the cylinder head, put a shim in between the cylinder block and the cylinder head so that when you install the cylinder head, you can get the pin and the bolt hole lined up before removing this shim and putting it down for good. Prepare all of the head bolts by dipping the threads into some motor oil and then coating the bottom of the head with some motor oil as well. I couldn't install the cylinder head and record it and talk about it all at the same time, so I just went ahead and installed it, and now I'll tell you what I did after the fact. I put a 1/16 inch bead of red RTV all the way from the crack to the top of both sides of the timing chain cover. I then installed a shim on top of the cylinder block right next to the pin that sticks out on this side. I had my wife pull back gently on the heater bypass pipe in order to hold it out of the way of the head. I set the head down on top of the cylinder block and tried to stay as far away from the bead of RTV as I could. Once I had it past the bypass hose connection, I had her run around the car and look down into this hole and line up the pin in the cylinder block with the hole in the cylinder head, and had her remove the shim once that was lined up. With the shim removed, I gently put the cylinder down, and of course at this point the RTV was squished into place. I then installed the bolt washers and bolts and ran them down with the bi-hex bit as fast as I could by hand, then used my torque wrench to torque them according to the order given in the service manual, and torqued them to first 10, then 20, then 30, then 35, then 36. And when I got to 36, I had to make about, I think, 3 passes before they were completely at 36 without turning at all. Once they didn't turn anymore on a complete pass through, I took my permanent marker and drew a small mark on the top of each bolt, and then turned each bolt using my breaker bar and the bit 30 degrees at a time, again following the same order as shown in the service manual. Turned them about 30 degrees 3 times, and then made 1/4 final pass through, making sure that they were fully turned 90 degrees. Use a single-edged razor blade to gently trim off the excess RTV from the top of the cylinder head and the timing chain cover. After 1 hour, it's time to install the timing chain cover fasteners. I'm going to start with the bolt that's so hard to get in and out that's inside the timing chain cover. So of course my first objective is not to lose this bolt inside the car, so I've tied a knot around the bolt in such a way that I can pull this end of the string and it will undo this knot and I can just pull the string out. This is just dental floss. And I've tied the other end of the string to the car. Now I'm going to use my magnetic capture tool and attach it to the bolt, and then I can simply put the bolt into the hole. Now I found I could not, unfortunately, put a ratchet over this bolt and install it that way. That would be the easiest way, of course, and I just couldn't do that. Once you have the bolt in the hole, you can hold it in place using either a flathead screwdriver, or I used an ordinary pair of scissors, and then just turn the bolt using your 10mm combination wrench. Be careful that the bolt goes in straight and that you don't cross thread it. While working with this bolt, make sure the chain is actually on the guide. If it's slipped over like this, you won't be able to get the ratchet onto the head of the bolt. But when it's like this, it's actually pretty easy to get your tools down in there. Torquing that bolt to the right number of inch-pounds is going to be a bit of a trick, but it's not too bad. The way we're going to do that is we're going to put the 10mm combination wrench on the bolt, and we're going to form a 90-degree angle with our torque wrench, and when we apply force to the torque wrench, we're going to apply it parallel to this bar. So this is 90 degrees, and then this will be 90 degrees. We're going to push straight this way. We cannot push this way, we can't push this way. If we push different directions, the math doesn't work out and you will not be applying 96 inch-pounds. But other than that, you don't really need to do anything. There's no adjustment math at all, as long as you keep this at 90 degrees and as long as you push directly down at 90 degrees over here. So you just set it to 96 inch-pounds and you're good to go. Here's what it looks like in practice. You have your combination wrench attached to the head of the bolt. Put the timing chain on the inside of the torque wrench, but on the outside of the combination wrench. Make sure you have your combination wrench and your torque wrench at a 90-degree angle. And when you push down, make certain you're not pushing toward the ground, but rather you're pushing at a 90-degree angle to the handle. Otherwise, it's exactly like doing a normal torque. Next, we're going to install the smallest bolts, which are about 1 inch long, and they are the D bolts. By the way, this is page EM22. The D bolts go here and there. They are supposed to be torqued to 8 foot-pounds, which is 96 inch-pounds. The first of those two is this bolt in here, and unfortunately I couldn't figure out any way to get my torque wrench down in there. I couldn't even play the same game that we did when we installed this internal bolt. So what I did is I just took my combo wrench and I set my torque wrench to 96 inch-pounds, and I just sort of tried to remember what this felt like. And then I torqued this bolt by hand. Use a 1/4 inch 10mm socket, and your torque wrench, I have to use an adapter, to torque this bolt to 96 inch-pounds. This is another 1-inch bolt. We'll install the 1.77 inch A bolt. It goes right there. Now the guide says, at least in my book, 10 inch-pounds for the A bolt. That's not correct. That should be foot-pounds. It also says 13 newton meters if you want to double check. So 10 foot-pounds is 120 inch-pounds. Use a 10mm socket on a short extension to reach the bolt down in here after you have it mostly put in. Thread in this stud, leaving the nut attached. Next we're going to install the stud that goes right here. Now unfortunately, although there's an arrow here, there's no letter, and I couldn't find any information on this stud anywhere in the manual. So I measured the stud, it is 6mm, and I went to the specified torque for standard bolts table and looked at a regular plain old hexagon head bolt, class 4T, 6mm, and that is 48 inch-pounds, which I think is perfectly reasonable. I don't happen to have a 1/4 inch torque wrench, so I'm just going to estimate this torque the same way that I estimated the torque on this bolt down here, and I'm going to install it using my E5 external Torx bit. Next we're going to install the nut onto that stud. Now the instructions do say to install 17 bolts and nut, so when you count all of these lettered arrows you come up with 17, and then there's this one without an arrow. I'm assuming that's the nut, and since there are no other torquing instructions, I'm also going to assume that since it has a 10mm head, that it falls under this others category and needs to be torqued to 8 foot-pounds. 10mm socket and 96 inch-pounds. One of the things that I forgot to record was that I changed the belt tensioner, and the reason that I did that is because this is a common fail item. In fact, I think my belt tensioner was bad. When it is bad, it causes noise when you're driving the car. Now, I did not replace the entire belt tensioner because in order to change the entire belt tensioner, you have to be able to remove this bolt. And according to what I read, the only way to remove this bolt is to jack the engine up slightly by jacking up under the oil pan. And at the time that I was working on this, the oil pan was already off, and I just didn't think that there was a good opportunity to do that. So instead of changing the whole thing, I only changed the piston part, which is the part that goes bad, or at least that's what I've read. And I did that by removing the bolt down here and just sliding this piston off. And I did the same thing with the new one and just swapped them. Now there was one special little thing that I had to do, and that was that I had no way of knowing what the torque was for the bolt that was supposed to go in here. So when I got the new tensioner, I marked the location of the bolt relative to the location of the body, took the bolt out, and then put it back into the exact same position using a torque wrench so that I could record how much torque it took for me to do that. In other words, how much torque did it take to put the bolt back exactly the same way it was before I removed it. And then I used that same torque reading when I installed the piston into this unit. Install the belt tensioner stud bolt to 82 inch-pounds. Put the bolt in, push down gently, line it up with the hole, and it goes right in. If you use an ordinary ratchet and the E7 socket to put that stud bolt in all the way to where it's almost but not quite fully torqued, then you should have just enough room to use a 3/8 inch torque wrench, an adapter, and the E7 socket if you push aside the brake line a little bit. The nut on the tensioner is 21 foot-pounds. It's a little tricky, but you can get this one from below. Remove the two nuts that hold in the timing chain tensioner. Set them aside. Pull out the tensioner and set it aside for now. Install the intake camshaft with the VVTi sprocket so that there's no slack between the sprocket and the crankshaft. That is, if you turn this clockwise, it moves, but if you turn it counterclockwise, it cannot move any further. You want to have this timing mark slightly clockwise, vertical relative to the surface of the head, and this small indentation on this tooth should be level, just about level with the surface of the head. Install the other camshaft and rotate it so that this pin is sticking up and to the left. And this cam is pointing up and to the right. Now here's where these yellow links come in handy. However far the yellow link is away from this timing mark, that's how far this yellow link should be away from this timing mark. Now be careful, because there's one labeled in, one labeled exhaust, and there's this central timing mark. It's this central timing mark that should line up with the same spot on the chain. So on my intake, this yellow link is one left of the timing mark, so I want this yellow link to be one left of that timing mark. Once you have the timing chain correctly placed onto the sprocket, put the sprocket onto the camshaft. Now this is a bit of a trick. You need to lift the camshaft out and tilt it at an angle so that it lines up, and then you slide the sprocket onto the shaft, and then you kind of have to rotate the camshaft while putting it down into the hole, and it is a little bit of a trick. And then you can put the bolt into place. If you've done everything correctly, you should have 2 indentations on the timing shafts lined up relative to each other and approximately level with the head of the engine. Also, there should be no slack on this side, and the distance between the yellow link and this timing mark should be exactly the same as this distance between this yellow link and that timing mark. Put on some gloves and make sure that all of the bearings and journals have lubrication. Install the number 1 journal bearing cap, making certain that the holes in the bearing cap line up with the pins on the head. Don't try to seat it all the way down just yet though, because it won't seat properly until we tighten down the middle bearing cap bolts. Put the bolts into the bearing cap, but don't try to screw them in at this point. Lubricate and install the remaining bearing caps. Now we're going to double check to make certain that we put them back in the right position, even though we took them off in order. Read the top of the cap. This one says E5. That's exhaust number 5 journal. These numbers are journal numbers, not cylinder numbers. This is the first journal, second journal, third journal, fourth journal, and the 5th journal. The arrow points toward the front of the engine. Remember, the front of the engine is where the pulleys are. Now, if you meet any resistance at all while you are installing these bolts, it's almost certain that you have them cross-threaded. So take the bolt out and try again. Slowly working your way up to 10 foot-pounds, in several passes, tighten the bearing caps in the order shown in the service manual on page EM47. The smaller bearing caps need a 10mm socket on your inch-pound torque wrench. I'm starting at 25 inch-pounds. Once you get back to the number 1 journal bearing cap, the camshafts will be properly lying in all of their grooves, and you'll be able to seat the bearing cap properly with the pins and the holes. Then just run down the bolts and use a 12mm socket on your inch-pound torque wrench to torque these bolts to 25 inch-pounds, just like the rest. Go back through at 60 inch-pounds, 90, 120, go through at 120 inch-pounds a second time, and you come back around to the number 1 journal cap, torque it to 17 foot-pounds. That's 204 inch-pounds. Then I think it's wise to run your torque wrench back down to 120 inch-pounds and double check the rest of the bearing caps. Be sure you run the torque wrench through 0. Use a 14mm combination ratchet to get the bolt mostly inserted. Use one hand to hold a crescent wrench attached to the hexagonal portion of the camshaft. Use your other hand to turn a torque wrench with a 14mm crowfoot and a 1.5 inch extension set to 40 foot-pounds according to page EM19. You can use the same 90-degree trick we used previously. Reinstall the timing chain tensioner. Reinstall the 2 nuts. Use a 10mm socket to torque the bottom nut to 80 inch-pounds. Add a 3-inch extension to get the top nut. Release the latch by pushing back on the guide and letting go. After you've released the timing chain tensioner, if you turn the exhaust camshaft clockwise, you'll see there's only a little bit of slack left in the chain. Use a single edge razor blade to remove any gasket material from the oil pan mating surfaces. In retrospect, I wish I had not removed the oil strainer, because now I have to go buy a gasket. And this gasket did not come in the head gasket kit. After you've replaced the oil strainer gasket, hand thread on the nuts and the bolt. Torque all 3 to 80 inch-pounds. Next time I have to remove the oil pan from the car, I'd like it to be easier, so I skipped the RTV and went for a Felpro oil pan gasket. If you do decide to use a Felpro oil pan gasket, you need to know that while it looks symmetric, the gasket is in fact not. So line up the holes here to make sure that you have it installed correctly. Getting the gasket to stay on during installation is a bit of a trick. You could use some RTV to tack it down. I opted to use some magnets to hold in the bolts. That way I have something to hang the gasket on during installation. Before installing each bolt, visually confirm that the gasket is in the right place. Torque the oil pan fasteners to 80 inch-pounds. Torque these fasteners in stages. Start at 25 inch-pounds, then do 50 inch-pounds, and then go to 80 inch-pounds. When you get to the fasteners that are over here, there's really no good way to get them with the torque wrench, so you just have to estimate it using your combination wrench. Once you've finished installing all the bolts, reinstall the plastic cover. Move the old oil filter. Put a new oil filter's gasket with a little bit of fresh motor oil. Thread on the new oil filter by hand until the seating surfaces just touch. Turn an additional 3/4 turn. Remove these 2 top bolts just by lifting straight out. I believe this bag contains the replacement seals for the 2 that we just removed, but I'm actually not 100% positive because I don't know what those O-rings are for, first. And secondly, these seals have a slightly larger inside diameter than the original seals do. So while the screws did not easily fit through this piece, they very easily fit through this one. Regardless, they look very similar, and so I do believe that they are the correct replacement parts. So, having said that, the originals went in with this small bump facing down. So again, I guess put the small bump facing down, put the bolt through, and as I said, these just slide right on, and place them. I hope that's correct. Seat the valve cover gasket into the valve cover. Pour 4.5 quarts of conventional oil over the camshafts and timing chain. Wipe up any spills, remove the towels that were plugging the holes. Place the valve cover. Install the engine wire bracket on this stud. Place the stud bolt, 2 nuts, and 6 bolts in the cover. According to the service manual, we're supposed to torque all of the fasteners with washers to 80 inch-pounds and all of the fasteners without washers to 8 foot-pounds. As far as I could tell, all of the fasteners seem to have washers with the exception of the 2 bolts that went through the grommets. So I'm going to assume that this 8 foot-pounds is for the 2 bolts with the grommets. Remove this nut from the stud bolt and use a 12mm deep socket and your torque wrench to tighten this fastener to 80 inch-pounds. Place the nut so it doesn't get lost. Use a 10mm socket on a 3-inch extension to tighten this nut to 80 inch-pounds and all of the bolts. And the 2 top bolts to 96 inch-pounds. Use the 5/8 inch O-ring spark plug socket and a long extension to reinstall the spark plugs and run them down by hand. Torque the spark plugs to 13 foot-pounds, which is 156 inch-pounds. That's on page IG3. Remember to hold the head of the torque wrench steady as you turn it so you don't break the spark plug. Remove the coil pack bolts one at a time and reinstall the coil packs. Page IG5 tells us we need to torque the ignition coil packs to 62 inch-pounds. Do that using a 10mm socket. Page EM88 says we torque the water bypass pipe to 80 inch-pounds. Use a 1-inch extension and a 10mm socket to torque the bolt. If you have any leaks in the engine compartment, now is a very good time to repair them. If you were wondering why it was I removed the alternator when I didn't really need to for this project, it was because I had a leak at the water inlet. And the cause of that leak was the nitrile gasket on the thermostat. Pretty much all of the nitrile parts in this car are failing at this point. The car is 12 years old. It's a 2001. It's currently 2013. And I think that while we have the engine as far torn apart, it makes sense to replace every single nitrile gasket and O-ring we can get our hands on. This particular gasket comes in the Velcro gasket kit that we purchased for the head, so there's really no reason not to change it right now. If yours hasn't failed yet, it probably will, unless it's been changed recently. And this was an easy repair to do. You just pull this portion off and put on the new gasket and put this back on again. And I believe these are torqued to 80 inch-pounds or 96 inch-pounds. I forget which, but you can certainly look it up in the service manual. I also had a leak here, so I pulled this off, cleaned up the contact surface, cleaned up the hose, and put it back together. I probably should have changed the hose, but I didn't have the replacement at the time, and I'll still have access to this if I need to change it later, even after I put in the alternator. I also changed the O-ring on the dipstick. That was very easy to do. There's a bolt, just one, that holds it in. It's right here, and you just take the bolt out and lift the dipstick up out of the engine, turn it sideways, pull off the old O-ring, and replace it with one from Ace or wherever, as long as it's made of nitrile. The ones from Ace are all made of nitrile. Pretty much all O-rings that you get over the counter are made of nitrile. This is a 1/2 inch outside diameter by 3/8 inch inside diameter by 1 inch thick O-ring. Put a little bit of soapy water on it, slip it on, put this back into place, and then torque the bolt to 96 inch-pounds. There are other O-rings and other gaskets in the car. I'm going to try to change as many as I can. I didn't realize that there were gaskets for the fuel rail, but I purchased those from Amazon and they'll be arriving soon. There's an O-ring in the oil control valve. And I don't know if there are any others, but I'm sure I'll find them as I put the car back together. Reattach the heater hose and replace the clamp. Reinstall this S-shaped hose and use a pair of pliers to slide the hose clamp back into place. When properly installed, the hose will snake down and roughly end up between these other two hoses. We're going to replace the oil control valve. Again, I recommend you replace this O-ring. It's only about 90 cents from Ace Hardware. It is a 3/4 outside by 9/16 inside by 3/32 inch thick O-ring. Remove the bolt here, replace the valve, put the bolt back. I couldn't find a torque specification for this bolt in the service manual, but it is a 10mm head bolt with no washer, and all of the other ones we've been doing have been 96 inch-pounds when they have no washer, so I'm going to assume that's the torque. I'm using a 10mm socket on a 3-inch extension. Now the filter. Make sure there's no debris inside or outside the basket. I went ahead and ran mine through an ultrasonic cleaner for a few minutes and cleaned the inside of the bolt. This just slides into the end of the bolt, and you can insert it by hand. Make sure that the washer is in place. According to the service manual, that's actually a gasket. I don't have a replacement, and it does not look like a common type of gasket, so I did not bother to do anything to it. If it leaks, then I guess I'll order a replacement. Torque the filter bolt to 21 foot-pounds. 14mm socket and 1 inch of extension is good. Now we're going to reinstall the engine coolant temperature sensor. I thought that the head gasket kit that I purchased would have this copper crush washer in it, but it didn't. And since I didn't know ahead of time that was going to be the case, I didn't buy one. I recommend that you go and buy one, but since it's Labor Day weekend and I cannot, I'm going to go ahead and reuse this copper crush washer, and I will show you how I do that. Basically what we're going to do is lap the surface to remove any imperfections. Then we are going to anneal the copper to make it soft again. You have to anneal it, otherwise it's work hardened and will not properly form to the surface when we install it. Then after it has been annealed, I will lap off any gunk that remains from the annealing process. I just have a piece of glass in a bathtub with some water and some 600 and 1500 wet or dry sandpaper. And I'm just going to run this on the sandpaper in a figure-8 pattern, both sides, first at 600 and then at 1500, until it's nice and flat again. And when it's ready, there won't be any more of these marks that you can see on here. Grab the washer with your fingernails and move in a figure-8 pattern. Now I'm going to anneal the copper by heating it to a nice cherry red so that it will be soft again. Wash the crud off the washer. Then I lapped it to get rid of any of the junk that was left after the annealing process, and presto, ready to install. Put the copper crush washer onto the sensor and then hand thread it in place. The correct torque for the ECT sensor is 14 foot-pounds or 144 inch-pounds. Use a 19mm deep socket to do the installation. The camshaft position sensor uses the same size O-ring as did the oil control valve. Remove the bolt, place the sensor. Torque the bolt to 79 inch-pounds. Use a 10mm socket. Torque the engine hanger bolt to 28 foot-pounds. Use a 14mm socket. Clean the intake manifold mating surfaces. Remove any stuffing you might have placed in the cylinder head. Take out the bolts and nuts. Place the new intake manifold gasket. Make sure the engine wire is out of the way. Place the intake manifold. Remove the hose clamp bolt. Place the hose clamp and put in the bolt by hand. Remove the engine wire protector bolt. Put the engine wire brackets over the studs. Place the engine wire protector bracket and replace the bolt. Use your torque wrench to get an idea of what 80 inch-pounds feels like, and then torque the bolt to that amount. Replace these two bolts and a third bolt through the hose clamp. Place the two nuts over the engine wire brackets. When you're installing the engine wire bracket, be certain this little tab doesn't get hung up on the intake manifold. Remove the two bolts for the manifold stay and replace the manifold stay. The two singleton nuts and bolts, the two manifold stay bolts, and the nut and bolt on the hose clamp all get torqued to 14 foot-pounds. That's 144 inch-pounds. Use a 12mm socket on 4 inches of extension. Start in the middle and work your way out from there. The hose clamp, switch to a 1-inch extension for the bottom manifold stay bolt, and no extension for the upper. Reattach the oil control valve connector. Reattach the triangularly shaped engine coolant temperature sensor connector, making certain that this slot in the connector lines up with this protrusion. Reconnect the camshaft position sensor. So this is a bit of a bummer. I realized that the connector for my crankshaft position sensor is broken. Now what? Well, the answer is that we can buy a new one. Buy a 1-day pass on the TIS Toyota Technical Information System server. Find the electrical wiring diagram. Choose the part number of connectors page. Locate C1, camshaft position sensor. There's the part number for the connector. Go to this website, newunitedracetech.com/OE_PN.ASPX. Search for your part number. Here's mine. There's the part. And you can order it right there. You can also do a search in this box here, although I found that this, for some reason, only seems to return refurbished parts. I don't know why that is. Obviously, my new connector is not going to come right away, so I just improvised a latch using a piece of wire. Remove the two bolts for the grounding wires. Attach the grounding wires. This is a 5T bolt. It's 6mm, so we're going to torque this to 56 inch-pounds. Use a 10mm socket. Remove the fuel rail bolt. Remove the two fuel rail bolts. Place the fuel rail and then double check to be certain that the grommets have not fallen into the engine. Place the bolts by hand and then double check to be certain that the injectors will rotate freely. Place the fuel rail bolt. Torque the two delivery pipe bolts to 14 foot-pounds. That's 168 inch-pounds. Use a 12mm socket. Torque the fuel pipe to cylinder head bolt to 7 foot-pounds. That's 84 inch-pounds. Use a 10mm socket on a 3-inch extension. Remove the tape and bits of glove from fuel lines and reconnect the fuel lines. Install the fuel pipe clamp. Reattach the injector engine wire connectors. Replace the grounding lug and the engine wire. Put back the two nuts. The nut has no mark. That's a 4-in nut. I measured it at 6mm, and that is 52 inch-pounds since this has a flange. Use a 10mm socket. Replace the ignition coil connectors. In retrospect, I really don't know why the service manual had me wait so long before removing the upper radiator hose. It's really totally in the way when trying to remove these hoses from the engine. So when you go to do your car, certainly I suggest you remove this radiator hose first. Reconnect the evap hose. It runs from over here at this solenoid thing down here and to the uppermost connection. Replace the hose clamp. Replace the brake booster hose. That's the one that runs from the metal pipe back here. It goes on the bottommost connector. Replace the hose clamp. Now, this isn't strictly necessary, but oh look, IAC air valve gasket, and it's either rubber or nitrile. So I've got the throttle body out. I'm going to change it. Remove the 4 screws from the idle air control valve. Off the idle air control valve. Remove the old unhappy gasket. Use a single-edged razor blade to clean this mating surface. This is a bit interesting. I realize that this is the water bypass chamber, and it looks like water has been leaking past the gasket here. So I'm guessing my car has been ingesting small amounts of radiator fluid as it runs. That's all of the gunk that came off when I used my razor blade. Use an air compressor to blow out any junk. And this surface had a lot of dried on radiator fluid and other gunk in here, so I just decided to give it a bath in my ultrasonic cleaner. Put on the new gasket and replace the top and screws. Clean up this mating surface. Remove anything you've stuck in here and the nuts and bolt. Clean the mating surface. Install the gasket so this extra flat area covers up this hole, and also so that the holes line up. Obviously this is wrong, so we'll turn it around. Place the throttle body. Install the 2 nuts. Attach the accelerator cable using a bolt. Hand tighten. Torque the 2 nuts and the bolt to 15 foot-pounds. That's 180 inch-pounds. Use a 12mm socket. Hold this portion steady while you torque this bolt, or it will turn as you torque. The 2 nuts as well. Pull back the throttle body and reinsert the throttle cable. Reconnect the inner bypass hose. It's the one that is S-shaped and connects to the engine up there. Replace the hose clamp. Install the second water bypass hose. It's the one that goes to the heater bypass pipe. Reinstall the hose clamp. Reattach the engine wire bundle. Attach the IAC valve connector to the IAC valve. Attach the throttle position sensor connector to the throttle position sensor. Thread this PCV hose down through here, connect the upper portion here. Reclamp it. Reattach the other end of it here and reclamp it. I personally think this is a much more logical time to install the upper radiator hose. Slide this into place and reconnect the hose and reattach the hose clamp. I think it's easiest to get to the clamp from this angle. Now we can attach and reclamp the upper PCV hose. Remove the wadding and reinstall the intake hose. Retighten the 2 screw clamps. I was taking another look at my alternator before I installed it. I'm getting ready to flatten the surface, and I think I realized what it is that gave me so much difficulty installing it. There's a press nut here that the bolt threads into, and I think what happened is whoever installed this alternator must have torqued this bolt down much too hard and pulled this nut through further than it was supposed to go and basically wedged the thing in there. So I'm not 100% positive of that, but it is definitely too tight, so I'm going to try to knock this nut back that direction a little bit before reinstallation. I threaded a bolt into that press nut and banged on it a little bit to try to force it out. I wouldn't say that it moved at all that I could tell, but between that and sanding down the high surfaces on all of the mating surfaces, both on the alternator and on the car, and adding a little bit of engine oil to the mating surfaces before reassembly, it now feels like I would expect it to. I wouldn't say it was easy to put in, but with a small amount of force, it slid into place. And thread the 14mm bolt and the 12mm bolt. Now, I hope this is a typo because the 2 heads that I have on my alternator are 14mm and 12mm. It says 17 and 14. But I'm guessing the larger bolt is supposed to be torqued to 40 foot-pounds and the smaller one to 18 foot-pounds. Certainly those torques seem reasonable. 18 foot-pounds with a 12mm socket and 40 foot-pounds with a 14mm socket on a 1-inch extension. Reattach the generator connector. Thread the zip tie around the wire and push the zip tie back through. Remove the generator wire nut. Place the generator wire facing upward. Put the teeth pointing in, and they should sort of lock in place, and you can replace the nut. Slide the wire clamp back onto the bracket. They didn't specify a torque for the generator wire, however, the insulator that goes under it was supposed to be torqued to 36 inch-pounds, so that seems like a reasonable torque. Use a 10mm socket. Slide on the rubber cap. Inspect your belt and replace it if it needs to be. According to the service manual, cracked areas on the ribbed portion are actually okay. We're mainly looking for frayed cording and cracks on the back. Find a copy of the belt routing through the engine and install the belt according to the diagram. I think the easiest way to do this is to thread everything correctly with the exception of the alternator. Put a 19mm socket on a breaker bar and attach it to the hexagon protrusion on the belt tensioner. Rotate clockwise, and now you should be able to put the belt onto the alternator. Clean the exhaust manifold mating surface. Remove whatever protective stuffing you may have placed in the exhaust. Then remove the 5 exhaust manifold nuts. Remove any stuffing you have down here, and remove this exhaust manifold bolt. Place the new exhaust manifold gasket. Place the exhaust donut. Remove these 2 bolts from the exhaust manifold. Place the exhaust manifold. Make sure the donut is still in the right spot. Thread back on the 5 nuts. Torque the 5 nuts to 27 foot-pounds. Use a 12mm deep socket and a couple of inches of extension. Start at 10 foot-pounds, then 20, then 27. Do a final pass at 27 again to make sure everything is correctly torqued. For each pass, start at the middle nut and then work your way out from there. Remove 6 bolts that hold on the exhaust manifold's upper heat shield. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Place the heat shield. Torque the upper heat insulator bolts to 9 foot-pounds. That's 108 inch-pounds. Use a 12mm socket to get the 2 bolts in the middle. A 3-inch extension makes it a little easier to get the ones on the top. Use a 12mm crowfoot along with our 90-degree trick in order to get the 2 bolts toward the bottom. We only took out 1 manifold stay bolt, and we're going to replace it and torque it to 37 foot-pounds. The exhaust manifold should already be lined up with a stay, but you should double check just to be certain. Unfortunately, there's very little room in here for torque wrench, so you're going to have to use your combination wrench to get it almost to the right torque, and then finish it off with the torque wrench. It was so tight I ended up having to manually advance the gear each time. I would basically push this all the way forward, take it off, manually advance 1 tooth, put it back, torque the bolts with the springs that hold the exhaust pipe to the exhaust manifold to 46 foot-pounds. Replace the 2 bolts. Use a 14mm combination wrench to alternately tighten both sides. These 2 bolts turn relatively easily, except for the springs making a bunch of noise, right up until the point that they bottom out, and then you'll hit your torque limit very rapidly. Replace the heated oxygen sensor gasket, or better yet, put on a new one if you have it, and replace the heated fuel oxygen sensor. Thread on the 2 oxygen sensor nuts. Ideally, you would use 2 new nuts. Torque them to 14 foot-pounds. If you decide you want to buy new nuts, here's the part number. With a 12mm socket and 4 inches of extension, I can just barely get this torque wrench to turn in here. But you can do it, 1 click at a time. Replace the relay we took out. Replace the cowl, making sure that everything is tucked away the way it's supposed to be. And also make certain that this hole goes over the stud. And replace the nut. Reattach the negative and positive cables. Retighten with a 10mm tool of your choice. Replace the cap. Refill the radiator with radiator fluid of your choice. Open this fuel box by pulling back gently on the tab and lifting up. On this side and on this side. Remove the electronic fuel injection fuse here. Double check in whatever it was you used to hold your parts to make certain that you don't have any spare parts left over. Make a final inspection of the engine and perform a tool audit. Turn the engine over for about 20 to 30 seconds. When you put the key in the ignition, the fans are going to turn on right away. Don't worry about that, that's just because the EFI fuse is out. Replace the fuse. And finally, the moment of truth. She runs!